Well, morning everyone, and it's nice to see such a good crowd, and it's always fun to be back at First Presbyterian. This is the John Trotty class, right?
Yes.
So I did think of the same thing with the Tar Heels convincing victory. My wife is a Tar Heel Medical School graduate, so we were happy last night. Neither of the games was even particularly close. So the two hottest teams in the tournament. Hopefully we'll have a good one on Monday night. And it's also it's wonderful to be with you during a time of exciting transition. I think it's a wonderful development to have Steve Eason as your interim pastor. So it's this is great. So after Easter, sometimes it's nice to delve into a topic that relates to Jesus, but that also might be one with which we're not as familiar. Some of you I know will be somewhat, but others maybe not as much. One of in talking to your the folks here about what we might talk about after Easter is done, the Dead Sea Scrolls and Jesus and really the social world in which Jesus lived and had his ministry has come up a lot in my discussions. So, and it's something I work on a lot. So, thought we'd do a three-part series on that, and with really an eye towards understanding the cultural, religious, social landscape out of which the Jesus movement arose. The scrolls probably help us more than anything else in contextualizing that. So today we're going to do just a basic overview of what the Dead Sea Scrolls are and what their significance is. And as much as any topic in the area in which I work, the Dead Sea Scrolls are the most controversial. Not in the sense of what they are, but in the sense of what they represent. And so I'm going to go over some of these pieces with you, and we can talk about them as we go through the PowerPoint. And if you have any questions along the way, because I'm covering about 4 or 5 discrete topics, please raise your hand and let me know. That's Iceland, not the... about as far as you can get from the Dead Sea as possible. So just some basics, and I'll read this for those who may not be able to see it fully. Discovered in 1947, surely the most important archaeological find of the 20th century, I would argue, of any archaeological find, but certainly for those of us who study the Palestinian region, the world of the Bible, and are seeking to understand the period in which the Bible was written, by far the most important. Corpus of biblical manuscripts, community or sectarian documents, and other texts. Discovered right next to the Dead Sea on the road from Jericho to Masada. So as you go southeast from Jerusalem, there's a road that is still a highway today, but was also a highway in the ancient world. You know the parable of the Good Samaritan, in which a traveler is walking south from Jerusalem. And if you keep going down, you hit the city of Jericho, which was one of the most early occupied cities. And then if you keep going south towards Masada, you'll hit Qumran. And the Dead Sea would be on your left as you're going south, and the Qumran site would be up on a perch on the right. So everybody know what Masada is? Masada is the fortress, the Roman fortress that was built by Herod, that the Jews retreated to and held out against the Romans for about 3 years before they were defeated. Okay, so basically 3 and a half periods of occupation in which this site we know that it was inhabited. First, an early one, the ones we're really particularly interested in are periods 1 and 2. There was an abandonment at some point from 9 BC to 4 BCE, either because of political upheaval or some people suggest that there was a fire, but for about 5 years it was unoccupied and then reoccupied until the Romans destroyed it in 68. It was a small Roman garrison for about 4 or 5 years and then was abandoned. These are a couple of pictures I've taken at various points that in which I've been. One of the really interesting things is there's about 13, what the Hebrew word would be mikvah or mikvaot, which are ritual purification baths. And they're scattered throughout the site, and one of the things, and there's reference to them in the scrolls themselves, and people, those who lived there, would walk down the steps 2 or 3 times a day and immerse themselves and come back up either prior to worship, prior to reading Torah. We don't really exactly know, but we know that they did it on a regular basis. What's interesting about this, of course, is that it relates to ritual immersion vis-a-vis baptism. So this shows that the notion of, and this is right up the road from, we'll talk about this next week, the whole hypothesis that John the Baptist was connected with this group in some way. So the fact that they were so interested in purificatory measures is really interesting. So these are scattered throughout the site. This long room is thought to be a refectory where communal meals would have taken place along with potentially Bible study. And so the thought is, you can see that there would have been long tables, and this conforms to other sites which would have been considered common eating and meeting space. Another site, this is next to that, there were inkwells found here, suggests that this was a place where scribes, priests, those who were literate, would have sat and copied texts. And we know that they copied a whole lot of texts because there were a bunch found in the caves near the site. All right. This is one of the more controversial things, and this is sort of controversial stopping point 1. There's a cemetery about 35 meters from the rooms that I was just pointing you to. And I can't remember how many bodies are buried there, but a couple of interesting things about them. They have a north-south orientation, which is a bit at variance with what we find in some other cemeteries from this period. Most people were buried in loculi, or family tombs, meaning that it was cheaper, more expeditious, and would have reflected the more clan mentality that I would have been buried with my family members in a family chamber, but these were individual graves. In most cases, solitary wood coffins on a north-south axis. Now, why is this important? One of the suggestions, and I think this is one I actually buy into, is that by this time in the development of Judaism, you had a belief among this group and others in individual immortality. And so there was much more of an emphasis on what the fate of each individual soul was based on his or her conduct. Whereas in most of Judaism prior to this, everybody goes to Sheol and nothing happens to it. We all go to the same place when we die, which is nowhere. And so you have an emergence of apocalyptic ideas. And so that would, of course, make a more individualized set of ethics and beliefs in what would happen to each of us. So that's been one suggestion. So that's point 1. Point 2, which I think is perhaps more controversial in light of the cemetery, is the fact that there are female bones that have been found in the cemetery, but they have only been found among, there's a sort of a main portion and then an outlying portion. Now, why is it important whether or not female bones have been found and when they can be dated? Because for most of the time in which the scrolls have been studied, the thought has been this was a sectarian settlement of celibate individuals. And by that, it's sort of a quasi-monastic order. It's not, we really wouldn't speak of monks when we're referring to an ancient Jewish sect, but there's references to only males being present in a couple of the texts, which raises the question, were females there at all? If you wanted to join, did you have to be a male and vow to be celibate? One of the things that we have to note is the person who first excavated the site was a French person named Roland Deveau, who was himself a Catholic priest. So some have argued that his bias towards wanting to read that into the text and into the archaeology played a role. So there's been great discussion as to when the females actually dated. Some archaeologists would now attest and say that some of the female bones date from these early phases and not from later periods. One of the issues in the cemetery is that some of the remains that have been found there are Bedouins who would date from later periods that wouldn't be from any period in which the ancient context in which I put in the slide a couple of slides ago. So again, it's I guess the other problem with that, with trying to come to terms with this, is that the Israeli Antiquities Authority, the body that allows people to dig in Israel, is not allowing further excavation in Qumran, and especially in the cemetery. So getting to the bottom of it is increasingly difficult, and we only have to go on the bones that are currently unearthed. So not all the coffins have been excavated. Yes.
Have they found any remains of children or young people?
There have been some children found. That's a good question. I couldn't remember that myself. I was reading about it this morning. There's one 15-year-old. We have to remember life expectancy was quite low during this period. Most of the bones, the individuals would have been between 30 and 45. The average age would have been somewhere in the 40s, perhaps, for the mortality rate because of disease or what have you. And then there's a couple of people in their 60s, and then a couple of people in their 50s. But there were several teenage bones. I don't remember if there have been children found, but I feel like one or two, but I feel like they're not sure when they date from. So it also has to do with how well the grave is preserved. So. Good question. Very good question. Okay, so the cemetery it is great bearing on how we interpret the text, because it raises the question of, were there only men there, which is the way we've often read all the texts. Okay, this would have been a tower of some sort, perhaps used for storage, also perhaps used as a lookout point. This sort of lies at the corner of the site and is one of the better preserved aspects of it. If you look from where I was just the tower there I just was in, especially from the refectory, the dining area, you see across. This is the most famous cave found near Qumran. This is Cave 4, where most of the largest number of texts were found. So when you talk about, there were 11 caves, and if you ever see reference to a text from the Dead Sea Scrolls, something from Cave 4 will say 4Q, meaning Qumran, and if it says PS, that would be Psalms. That would be one of the Psalm scrolls that was found at Cave 4. So if you say 4Q PS 3, that's what it means. So anytime you see a 4 before the text, that simply means it was found here. All right. I want to talk for just a minute about the original discovery. Two Bedouin shepherds found the scrolls, like I said, in 1947, and it's sort of an amazing story. One of their goats had wandered into the cave, and maybe it's apocryphal, but the story goes that one of them threw a rock and heard a clink. And he discovered that the rock had broken a jar. And then he walked in and realized that he was onto something. And so that led to the scrolls sort of, nobody really knew what they had, and they changed hands a few times. One of the things these guys did was they brought some of the texts to an antiquities dealer in Bethlehem named Kondo, and his store is still there. This is right in the heart of Bethlehem. And this is his grandson, who I talked to when I was there last, and he still has a little exhibit from being there. And a number of the texts found their way to this family. Just to show you, everything in Israel continues to be political. The store is right next to the wall that divides the West Bank from Jerusalem. So this is from looking out at the store. The wall's about 10 meters away. So it's nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but it just shows you everything's political over there. These are some of the jars. They found, and they held texts. And I'll explain what the scrolls contained in just a minute. But they held texts. The other thing that was found at the site that's really interesting is what we call phylacteries or tefillin or tefillin. Those of you who have seen pictures or engaged with Orthodox Jews, have you ever noticed that sometimes they have something on their forehead, a little box? That's known as a tefillin, and it's a box that contains verses from the Torah, such as Deuteronomy 6. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And the Deuteronomy passage says, write these on the forehead of your heart, and that on your forehead. Put them on your arms. Recite them when you get up. So that's taken very literally by Orthodox Jews even to the present day. What's so interesting is that these leather boxes were identified as tefillin, and they're almost they're older, but in terms of how they're constructed, these are 2,000 years old, and they're strikingly similar to what we would see today. So it shows you that this tradition goes back to the ancient world, which is fascinating. And a scholar 3 years ago discovered that it had been overlooked. Some of these leather containers actually have fragments from them. There were 6 scrolls that were discovered just 2 years ago in some of these tefillin that had been overlooked. And they have now been transcribed, and they are indeed verses from the Torah, which is just really, really interesting. I don't know how it would happen with eBay and Craigslist today. This is true. This went for sale in the early 50s. This was an ad in the Wall Street Journal. Biblical manuscripts dating back at least 200 BCE are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. Box F206, the Wall Street Journal. And they were bought and eventually all centralized. And there's a long story about how some of them were, some of this relates to the Six-Day War in 1967, and then Israel was able to get control of all the scrolls, but it took some time, and it was a bit of a circuitous route to get a hold of them, and this Wall Street Journal ad is one of the more famous things that people made a lot of money along the way. So, all right. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about, anybody have any questions so far? I know I'm going fast. Yeah.
So Israel, the country, owns all the scroll, and they are the readers of it and the whole authorities of it.
Now they are, yes, especially after 67 and when they took East Jerusalem. That enabled them to centralize, and now they control the Qumran area as well, which was formerly under the control of Jordan. So those two things, there's an entity known as the Israeli Antiquities Authority, which has if you've been to Jerusalem, you've been to the Shrine of the Book, which is where the Israel Museum is, and there's a whole ongoing exhibit. Now they do allow them to go abroad a fair amount, and there have been exhibits in Raleigh and in Washington at various points, which are well worth going to, but yeah, they are basically controlled by the IAA, yes. All right. Okay. Now, let's talk about what's in the scrolls themselves. The first thing we should say is that there's 2 basic divisions we can make. What we might call biblical scrolls, and then what we would call non-biblical or sectarian scrolls. Scrolls that relate to the life of the sect that lived there. Let's start with the biblical scrolls. And I put that in quotes, and I'll explain why in a minute, but let me go through it just a minute. Every biblical book but Esther is represented among the fragments found at Qumran, which is interesting. Why isn't Esther there? If you remember, Esther is a big story of celebration. It's the basis for the festival of Purim. And the thought is that either these guys were so straight-laced that they didn't celebrate Purim, and they thought it was a hedonistic celebration, or for some reason they didn't like the book of Esther. Esther doesn't mention God at all, which is interesting. So there's lots of theories as to why this is the case, but we have copies or portions of a copy of every book but Esther. The 2 longest and best preserved scrolls were a scroll of Psalms, which was huge and well preserved, and interesting. A scholar by the name of James Sanders was able to unroll and transcribe it. He was a Presbyterian pastor who had just finished his doctorate at Harvard. He was in his early 30s, right place, right time, and was able to be the one to publish the findings of the Psalm scroll. Interesting thing about that, which we is not necessarily known, is that the content of the Psalms in the scroll is different from what's in our Psalter, and so we have Psalms that didn't make it in that are in that, and the order's all different. So interesting that even as late as the 1st century CE, when Jesus would have lived, the order and content of the book of Psalms was different. All right, that leads to, the other thing is the great Isaiah scroll, an entire scroll, the book of Isaiah was found. Those are the two best preserved, both found, or one found in cave 1 and one found in cave 11. All right. This raises a really interesting question, and that is what notions of canonicity existed during this period. It is erroneous to speak of the Bible, actually. I refer to these as biblical scrolls because they were authoritative texts. But this community didn't know of a Bible the way we do because the canon wasn't yet closed. You did have the 5 books of Moses, the Torah. You had the prophets, and they're referred to several times. But you also had other texts that didn't make it into the canon that seem to have been very important to this community. And so when we speak of biblical as an adjective, it's too early to refer to this. Now, that's maybe surprising. Let me give a couple of, let me flesh that out a little bit. If you look at the New Testament, you'll see several points in which Jesus refers to the law and the prophets, right? He'll say, what do the law and the prophets say? There's one place in Luke where he says the law, it's the end of Luke where he says the law, the prophets, and Psalms. So there seems to be a third category of Psalms. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a couple of places, that one in particular that's quite noteworthy, where there's a reference to Moses, which would be the Torah, the prophets, and then the reference, it seems to be, it's a little fragmentary, but the word David seems to be there, which would refer David being the author of Psalms. So it's really interesting that lines up with what we find in Luke, the law, the prophets, and Psalms. But we have other books, Job, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Ruth, Ezra, Nehemiah, any number of books that don't fall into those two categories. We're not really sure. It's problematic and complicated to refer to a closed canon during this period. It was still somewhat of a fluid time in terms of authoritative text. Yes?
What is a canon? I hate to be so stupid.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. What is a canon? From where do we get the word canon? This is a term that is an Egyptian term. It refers to a reed or a measuring stick, like a papyrus reed. And it was used by the Greeks to refer to texts that they thought ought to be copied again and again and again, that they thought ought to be preserved. I mean, if we refer today to, don't we use the expression, what's in the literary canon? What constitutes a classic? That's an ongoing conversation we're having. What should we teach our kids? Especially as we think about a more diverse literary canon, whether you agree with that or don't. It's an ongoing sort of conversation as to what constitutes the corpus of books, poems, whatever that we should engage. There is no term during this period in which the scrolls were written for canon. That's a later Greek designation. The word is a Greek term. So during this period, it's beyond dispute that the biblical books that we refer to as biblical were authoritative for them. The point I'm trying to make is that what books those were, and some that didn't make it, and some that did but were altered, was still very much in flux during the period in which the scrolls were written, which is I think, a noteworthy point.
So a preacher who has been canonized is a guy who is included in a special group?
Yes. Like if you would refer to, that anytime something is canonized, it's included in an authoritative or sacred collection of books or people. Right now we're having a discussion as to, not we, but the Catholic Church is having a discussion, which is going positively, as to whether Mother Teresa is going to be declared a saint, and she will be. But it's a somewhat of a different matter as to when we talk about people and books. my larger point in talking about this was to say that using the term biblical during this period is a little tricky because there is no closed corpus just yet. All right. Apocalyptic beliefs in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I already mentioned this, but referring to the cemetery. Belief in an afterlife, division of history into periods. This is a real important piece, that there is a belief, and we see this in our own New Testament. Jesus says the days are surely coming. A lot. You have in the book of Revelation this sort of unfolding of history into various periods. Ours is an apocalyptic faith tradition. We as Presbyterians don't like to talk about that. We like to do things decently and in order. And talk about session meetings and who's going to be on what committees, and what date the service day is. I mean, that's what we're about, which is great. But many other people within our Christian fold talk about this stuff a lot more than we do. And one of the things that, if you just read through the New Testament, and we're going to do this some next week and sort of compare, you'll see that there's a great deal of imagery about a final end of days in which God's going to make everything right, the wicked will be punished, the righteous will be rewarded, and all will be right with the world. And the Dead Sea Scrolls is very similar to the New Testament in this regard. These are apocalyptic texts. The ones that are not, even some that are, but the ones that we would refer to as sectarian, and I'm going to show you some of them. So, division of history into periods. There's a war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, and we'll talk about that in probably more of our third session. Think about the amount of light-darkness imagery. One of the things I'm going to show you is the author of the Gospel of John knew these texts, used the imagery in these texts. Think about the opening chapter of John. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness can't overcome it. All the light-darkness imagery we get in John, we find it, and oftentimes the same phrases we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the New Testament Gospels and other books did not come out of a vacuum. They were part of a larger apocalyptic tradition within Judaism. And one of those things is a light between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. Next week, I'm going to spend most of the time talking about what it means to be a Messiah, and what does that term mean? How does it unfold in the New Testament, and how does it unfold in the Dead Sea Scrolls? The most interesting thing and most interesting difference between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament is in the scrolls, in most places, except for one or two, you have two Messiahs. Two who are going to make things right. One a priestly Messiah, and a royal Messiah. Jesus is often depicted in the New Testament as a royal Messiah. The very first thing you find in the Gospel of Matthew is a lineage from David down to Jesus. There's an effort to depict him as, at Christmas Eve, we sing Once in Royal David's City. All of that is an effort to try to depict Jesus as a royal Messiah. We do have one passage in Hebrews that refers to him, the book of Hebrews, as a royal priest according to the order of Melchizedek, and we'll talk about that. That shows up in the scrolls as well. But we have two figures who were cited in the scrolls at various points, the Messiahs of Aaron and Israel. All right. Let's unpack some of these afterlife beliefs and talk about the apocalyptic imagery we get here. These are from what's called the Hodayot, or the Thanksgiving hymns from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not part of the book of Psalms, but would have probably been sacred texts to them, coming back to our notion of canon. These certainly didn't make it into our canon, but would have been authoritative texts for them. I thank you, Lord, you saved my life from the pit. We get that a lot in our book of Psalms. From Sheol and Abaddon, you've lifted me to an everlasting height so that I can walk on a boundless plain. I know there's hope for someone you fashioned out of clay for an everlasting community. The corrupt spirit you have purified from the great sin so that he can take his place with the host of the holy ones and enter into community with the congregation of the sons of heaven. Notice how you have light darkness, you have an elect group and a non-elect group. You have a reference to the holy ones and the sons of heaven. One of the things that was characteristic of the group that lived there was that they considered themselves elect, but that they also considered themselves part of a company of angels that, in a sense, we have a term that we would use to refer to that called realized eschatology. And we have sects and groups like this today, those who believe in some sense that they have already attained a certain spiritual status, and that by their common worship together, they are in effect communing with the angels already. And this group certainly felt that way. They also felt that their afterlife would consist of joining with a heavenly chorus of angels, and that they would then become part of the congregation of the sons of heaven, those who are then able to worship in God's heavenly court in some sort of heavenly realm. Another text in this regard. This is a really cool one. That's not very good. Should have put it in black. I was trying to mix it up a little bit. The nature of all the children of men is ruled by these, the two spirits. During their life, all the hosts of men have a portion of their divisions and walk in both their ways. This is from the longest sectarian text called the Community Rule. The whole reward for their deeds shall be for everlasting ages, according to whether each man's portion in their divisions is great or small. That's a long-winded way of saying each of us has two inclinations within us. A wicked one, one that is tempted to greed, to lust, to money, and then a more righteous one that is tempted toward good works, community, and it's up to us to decide which inclination to follow. It's what we would call ethical dualism. And they believed that, and what's so interesting about this is that our internal struggle, our internal ethical struggle, is mirrored by this war going on between the sons of light and sons of darkness out there in the cosmos. And so, just as you have this sort of heavenly war going on, there's a war in each of our souls, and we have to decide which side we're going to be on. Again, read C.S. Lewis' The Narnia Chronicles. That's what's going on there. You have this heavenly war between light and dark forces. We all read to our kids The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is an apocalyptic scene between light and darkness. And the Community Rule is in that same, you have the last battle. Isn't that the last one? I haven't read them in a while. Okay. All right. As for the visitation would be the punishment or the reward for all who walk in this spirit. It shall be for healing, great peace, and a long life, and fruitfulness, together with every everlasting blessing, and eternal joy and life without end, a crown of glory, and a garment of majesty and unending light. So this is what happens to you if you're good. What's interesting here is it doesn't necessarily seem to imply physical resurrection, does it? It doesn't say, but I've really looked at this text and tried to figure it out. You get everlasting blessing, eternal joy and life without end. We all get a crown of glory. I guess we need some sort of body to wear that crown, a garment of majesty and an unending light. So fellowship with the angels seems to entail something not fully described, but the heavenly existence we enjoy is not necessarily fully fleshed out, nor is it clear that we even have flesh. So interestingly, and we can talk about this in just a sec, what time do I have to stop?
10:45.
Okay. I'll stop in a minute so we can have questions. I know I tend to, in true professorial way, get on a roll here. But interestingly, in the New Testament, we don't ever really get a full description of what the heavenly realm will look like. The closest we get is Revelation with the New Jerusalem and the heavenly city. But in the New Testament, in Paul and in the Gospels, there's never really some go-to description on what the heavens are going to look like. And the same is true in the Community Rule. Okay, this is really, if you're bad, the description of what happens to you if you're bad is much more vivid and descriptive. This is my favorite passage, I think, in the whole scrolls. So, a glut of punishments at the hands of the angels of destruction for eternal damnation, for the scorching wrath of the God of revenge, permanent error and shame without end, with the humiliation of destruction by the fire of the dark regions. All the ages of their generations they shall spend in bitter weeping, harsh evils, in the abysses of darkness until their destruction, without there being a remnant or survivor among them. So, Don't be with the sons of darkness is the bottom line. And again, this is an effort to try to sort of scare people straight, I think. There's this sort of this ethical dualism. The closest passage I can think of in the New Testament that would approximate this would be the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16. You know, when Lazarus is in the bosom of Abraham and the rich man's down there with the heat and all the discomfort and pain, and he looks up and he's like, oh my gosh, I screwed up. But he can't transgress the boundary in which he's been placed. So that is similar in my judgment. We'll talk about this more next week, but I just wanted to show you one passage. They shall be governed by the first rules in which the men of the community began to be instructed until the coming of the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. But I'll talk more next week about that and what that means. I just wanted to show you one text. All right. All right. One final thing, and then we'll take some time for questions about anything I've talked about so far. This was a sectarian group. We can agree on that. Max Weber, who was a great sociologist of the early 20th century, defined a sect as a religious community founded on voluntary membership achieved through qualification. And we'll maybe talk about this a bit more in the next week. There's really a lengthy period in which, similar to the way it would be if you joined a monastic order today, you have to go through a period as a novitiate. You have to go through a series of hoops in order to join. And then only after a couple of years are you a full-fledged member. The same is true here. When you join the group, you have to surrender your finances. I mean, whatever money bag you have. You have to live in community with this group and be in residence. You have to defer to those who are older than you, the priests and those who are more expert in the law, in the Torah. And so there's a whole bunch of sets of requirements. And then if you misbehave, you can be kicked out of the group. For anything as trivial as there's references to sleeping during lectures or sermons, or laughing at somebody when somebody's speaking. It's a very rigid set of rules, and so it would seem to be the text that we found would seem to fit with Weber's description on voluntary membership achieved through qualification. This was let me do the second definition, a deviant religious organization which is in tension with the socio-cultural environment. These guys did not like the way most Jews in the Roman period were practicing. They felt that they were too willing to assimilate to what they saw as wrong cultural practices. If you remember, during the Greco-Roman world, a lot of things were changing. I mean, there were, in Jerusalem, a gymnasium was open in which athletic games would take place. And in order to participate in athletic games, you wore little to no clothing. And so that was very controversial. One of the other big things was that these guys followed the solar calendar. This is a very important point. These guys followed the solar calendar, which means the number of days in a year is only going to be 354. We and most Jews follow the lunar calendar, which means 364, 365. If you follow the solar calendar, you could say, who cares? But what that means is all of your holidays are going to happen at a different time, which is obviously a point of controversy. So a deviant religious, they felt that they had to. One of the opening lines in their text said, "Prepare the way in the wilderness, a highway for our God," which is from Isaiah 40. They felt that they had to get out into the wilderness, into the desert, to retreat from Jerusalem because what was being practiced in the name of Judaism was wrong. Now think about today. We as Presbyterians are much more assimilationists. We are, part of the larger cultural context. I think it's great. I think the fact that we engage in civic leadership and consider it necessary to be part of the communities in which we live is an important aspect of our tradition and the Reformed heritage. But don't we also have Christian brothers and sisters who think we're nuts and think that we are too willing to compromise our faith ideals and traditions? Like you think about what would be some groups, like the Mennonites would be a good example. Who else? The Amish, yeah. Another sort of another deviant religious organization, which you could refer to as a sectarian group, would be Mormons, who would definitely be a bit more separatist from, and not just, those are more extreme examples, but even within sort of what we might call more mainstream Christianity, there's other groups that we would consider to be a bit more separatist. So no one would accuse Presbyterians of being a sect, but this group certainly was. Okay. One final thing, and I didn't put the, we can maybe talk about this next week. I'm more interested in talking about how it can inform our understanding of Jesus and the Jesus movement, because I think that's the most interesting. But so I'm sort of trying to get a whole bunch of stuff on the table, and then we're going to talk about Jesus in the New Testament the next 2 weeks. But I should mention the word Essenes, which is one of the Jewish sects from this period. What are some other Jewish sects that we know of from the New Testament? Zealots, yeah, good. Zealots, Pharisees, Sadducees, yes. So in Josephus and Philo, two Jewish writers from this period, and then from a Roman historian, Pliny the Elder, we have references to a group known as the Essenes. And what's interesting is that they had elaborate beliefs in the afterlife. In order to join, you had to go through a period of apprenticeship. You had to surrender your money. And you just line up the requirements that are listed in these texts, and it really does cohere with what we find in the scrolls, which would suggest that this was an Essene group. What's tricky about that is that the word Essene never shows up in any of the scrolls. So the Essene hypothesis would suggest that's true, but the similarities are so profound, so pronounced, that we should refer to this as an Essene group, which then would lead us to say there's a couple of places that it was probably a celibate, male-dominated, or completely male Essene settlement of separatist Jews who had retreated to this site south of Jerusalem in order to practice the faith as they saw that it needed to be. So when you see the reference to the Essene hypothesis, that's what it means. It's trying to argue that the description, they're fairly brief, but the descriptions of the Essenes in Josephus, Philo, and Pliny are very similar, if not identical, to what we find in the actual scrolls. So it shows us, and that will lead to something we'll discuss next week, was John the Baptist an Essene? Did he know about this group and consider himself to be one of their own? And he certainly was a separatist. He certainly was somebody who lived out in the wilderness. We'll spend about a few minutes next week discussing the pros and cons of that hypothesis. But in order to understand it, we first have to understand what it means to talk about someone who's an Essene. So I've put a whole bunch on the table. I can keep going, but let me see in our closing 5 or 10 minutes if we have some questions. There's a bunch. Okay.
When did the Essenes when did that movement start?
Probably about the time, Josephus and Philo date from the 1st century, and so contemporaneous with, and he refers to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and so contemporaneous with the Qumran community, 1st century CE, so the same time, they must have died out because they're not referred to in subsequent documents, and they're also, I feel like they're compared to a different sect that I'm trying to remember that's in Philo, but 1st century is basically the question, answer to the question. Yes?
Dates. Do we know when these scrolls were placed in the jars and deposited in the...
It's a very good question, yeah. That leads to, and I'm going to have to give a longer answer to that than maybe you wanted. Some have argued that there is no real connection between the caves and the site, which I don't understand that because, you look out the site, and the cave 4 is as close as that black car, so what, if they didn't put them there, who did? to answer your question initially is to say, some people think, and I think it has some validity to it, that the scrolls were hidden in the jars in the caves, perhaps when they knew the Romans were coming and they had to flee south to Masada. And that would be the most plausible explanation as to why this would have been the case. That there was an urgency and a need to store them, and they couldn't take them with them. Now, the related point is how we date scrolls. We do it on several ways. You use carbon dating, and the other way you do it is by the type of epigraphy, means the handwriting. If you look at handwriting from someone in the 19th century in the U.S., you can distinguish it pretty. It's, the cursive was quite different than, well, my kids don't even know cursive, so there you go. You just look at emails, right? But they base it on epigraphy and spelling as well as to when we date scrolls. So the scrolls almost certainly date from about the 1st century BCE, 1st century AD, and were hidden most likely in a situation of trauma or urgency. Did I answer your question? Okay. Other questions? Yes.
When you were talking about the angels and the sect's description of where we would go, it sounds like an echo in Jesus is talking about angels when someone was questioning him at one time. And it really sounded like an echo, and I wonder, did he know the beliefs of the Essenes, or did they know his beliefs?
Very good question. Very good question. Now, we date most of the Gospels from the end of the 1st century AD. So, now they undoubtedly preserve earlier traditions, and most of us believe they also preserve some historical truth to them. The religious landscape out of which the Jesus movement arose was indebted to a Jewish apocalyptic worldview. And so that worldview included belief in an afterlife, belief in sort of light, darkness, good, evil, ethical dualism, and it also included a belief in angels. And so, you see angels throughout the New Testament. Because this belief was so common among those with an apocalyptic understanding of the created order, I don't know that it's necessary to say that Jesus had to know these particular texts. What he did know was, and believed in, was very common to this group. I would argue that he probably did know about Essenes, and his beliefs are in many ways similar to Essenes. I think to me, there's so many parallels that it would make sense that he did. And the two that I would think of in particular would be the notion of, the angels and the afterlife, but also when you join his group, you surrender your purse, you surrender your money, you have to give up your possessions, and so that would seem to be another sort of uncanny parallel.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Also the messianic tradition as well, with the
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the notion of having messiahs, and again, a messiah is someone who comes to inaugurate a new age and comes and sits at God's hand. It is an earthly figure, but an earthly figure who only comes at the tail end of history to sort of right wrongs and inaugurate, like I said, we talked about the periods of history in apocalyptic texts. So same is true in these texts as we find in the New Testament. You had your hand up.
That's okay.
Okay. Last questions?
I have
Yes.
one. So these scrolls were discovered in 1947 and date themselves back to the early part of the 2000s, the century of the era of Christ.
Yeah.
And so, as a historical matter, they are an existing document. Were they effective in confirming what we have in our scripture?
Yes, a very good question. And I didn't really do adequate justice to that excellent question. If you go to your pew today and open the Bible, it's a translation of what's known as the Leningrad Codex, which is a 9th century AD manuscript, 900 years AD CE. And this was copied over the centuries by rabbis, scribes, and it's sort of best earliest attestation of the entire Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. Now, why it's so important to come back to the every biblical book is represented. We're now able to get, by having scrolls of biblical books that date from the 1st century BCE, it puts us 1,000 years closer to the actual writing of the Bible. That's probably arguably even more important than all this other stuff I'm talking about. Even we're talking about Jesus and his similarities, but your question is really important. And in most cases, remarkably, yes, it confirms what's in our Bible. In more than 90% of the time. There's a couple of interesting, in some cases Jeremiah is different. I mentioned the Psalms. Some Psalms are in that didn't make it into our Psalter. The order's quite different. And so there are some places that are variant, but it shows that the Bible is remarkably well preserved. In some cases, the Hebrew that's found in the Dead Sea Scrolls is much closer to the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Bible, which shows us that perhaps the Bible that we read is not necessarily the most ancient version of a particular verse or passage, and that the Greek preserves a better one. I don't think anybody's going to go change it, but it is the case that there are passages where it seems that ours is inferior to what was found there, but not in the vast majority. And most times it lines up.
So would it lead to any further revisions in
I think it's too late. I don't think we can revise the Bible, but we can. I mean, people like me can sort of nerd out at conferences and say, I think that this verse is wrong in the Bible, and because the Dead Sea Scrolls have X and our Bible has Y, but to make the leap now. There have been, like when the NRSV, which is what you have in your pew, was translated, there are a few places, just a handful, where the mistake or the discrepancy is so stark that the scholar decided to, make a little change. And so it does happen from time to time. For the most part, we're supposed to translate the Hebrew text that has been translated over the centuries and not sort of rewrite the Bible. But it is a very, very good question. I think we probably have to stop, or we have time for one more.
A few more.
Okay.
A few more minutes.
All right. Yeah, maybe one more. Yeah,
So the Book of Thomas is not in there, right?
No. That's a Greek text, and no, that is not in there. That's an early Christian text. So no, but somewhat contemporaneous. But it's that's a different kettle of fish. There are a few Greek manuscripts that were found, but only a couple. So, yes?
Okay, is there evidence that these people tried to recruit from the outside?
Yeah, they probably did.
Okay, because otherwise they're just insular and
Yeah,
then they
well,
go
now
away.
it's right. Especially, the other thing is, with any celibate group can't continue itself unless it just doesn't work. You got it. So there's one. Now, the usual hypothesis on that is that you had at Qumran and elsewhere perhaps some celibate male communities, and then there's another text called the Damascus document that suggests that families who were associated with this sect lived throughout the countryside, perhaps south of Jerusalem, in camps. And that, so you probably had different tiers, and that there were some families who adhered to these beliefs, who lived in camps, and still communed together, but that would have been a source of membership perhaps for the more, I don't want to say elite, but more celibate aspects. But again, all this is still controversial, but that's the most common assessment. There was one other thing I wanted to say. The other question is, how did they get money and have the resources to? It seems that they did do some regional trading. They did some farming. They, some who were involved in it probably did various scribal, agricultural mercantile things within this region in order to bring money into the sect. And they also got money because when a new member joined, he would surrender his resources. So that would have been the ways in which they would have. Now there are minority archaeologists, and they're very much in the minority, who suggest that it wasn't actually a sectarian settlement at all. One guy suggested it was a perfume factory, and that another said that it was a Roman villa, and that the scrolls are just there by happenstance, and that this was actually a wealthy Roman guy's house. But that's very much a minority viewpoint, especially in light of the layout of the site and the cemetery that lies right next to it. So, but those are two things that have gotten a lot of attention, but not many supporters. Okay, so we're continuing this the next couple of weeks. Thanks for such a good start. So next week we'll hone in much more on the New Testament.
Good start, huh? Good stuff.